In order to help you see blockchain's biggest use case, I have to ask you a question. Does anyone here have number 31? Okay, let me rephrase the question. Does anyone here have the 31st human right? Well, you can't. I'm glad no one raised their hands. That would have been really weird. Because there are actually only 30 human rights in the world. Everyone watching this video and everyone in this audience today has 30 human rights. Now, these human rights are bestowed upon all humans as they're born on the planet. Human rights feel normal, but they were not always here. They started a couple of thousand years ago, and there was a defining moment when Cyrus the Great declared on a scroll that all humans have freedom of choice. This was about 2,500 years ago. And this scroll actually exists today. It's in museums. It rotates across the world. And it's a representation of the first thought that we can have human rights as a human being. Now, how do we go from there to the 30 we have today? Well, it took about 2,500 years and a lot of debate and discussion and formation of organizations such as the United Nations until 1948, when the United Nations ratified 30 human rights for all human beings. The rights are kind of awesome. They're like, you have the right to rest, which means that you can't be enslaved forever. You could take rest. You have the right to protest. They're the basic things that we need. They were made in a form of government called centralization. Centralization, in its basic form, suggests that we don't know how to behave. And as a result, we should have some form of central government with power in order to tell us how to behave and then enforce our behavior. Everyone here has experienced centralization. Starts with your parents when you're young, your governments, your religious leaders. It's all a centralized formation. Now, centralization feels permanent, but it in itself is not. It's actually fairly new. Prior to centralization, we were decentralized beings. I could walk into your cave, steal your bananas, assuming there were bananas back then, and you can't really do anything about it. Or I can invade your entire tribe and take over all your produce, and you have little recourse of property. We were quite savage. We were decentralized and disorderly. It's hard to debate that all centralization is bad. There is good that came from centralization. There are many good things in the world that are a result of centralization. The question today, though, is have we over-centralized? Have we OD'd on centralization? What blockchain allows us to do is it allows us to test, for the first time as a species, it allows us to test hypotheses on what are the things that are currently centralized that we may want to see whether it can exist in a decentralized manner or not. What blockchain allows us to do is it allows us to take things that came from centralization and test a hypothesis to see whether it could exist in a decentralized manner. Now, I know most of you must have heard of Bitcoin. Most of you must have heard of cryptocurrencies. What these are is they are the results of testing a hypothesis to see whether currency could be decentralized. Currency is one of those things that is made from centralization. You just can't decide that you have a currency. Some governing body that has a pool of power has to tell you what a currency is. They tell you what the price is, and they also tell you who can have it and how you can use it. Blockchain is a tool that allowed us to test a hypothesis that says, if 200 million of us decide what a currency is between ourselves, decide how it's going to work, and decides the price, who the hell is the government to tell us that that's not a currency? That's the use case of blockchain, to test hypothesis on whether things that were once centralized can exist in a decentralized manner. The first experiment of blockchain tackled a significant hypothesis. Essentially, what is a currency? And over the last 7 years, we've seen thousands of those experiments get played out in one currency after another, one ICO after another, many times impacting local neighborhoods, impacting countries, and reshaping the economic landscape of the world. This is a representation of the ICO market at the end of 2017. This happened in about 4 years. It took us about 1,500 years to figure out fiat currency. Fiat currencies can be measured in the hundreds. Crypto-built currencies can be measured in the thousands. Now, it's no question that most of this is going to be useless. But there are a few, maybe a dozen, maybe 24, that will actually reach the sanctity and the fidelity of fiat currencies. And because they're made in a decentralized way and run in a decentralized way, they will very likely reshape the economic landscape of the world. So the first experiment is ongoing. The question today is, what else should we test? What else is made in a centralized way that we can test to see if it would run in a decentralized manner? Now, there are things such as religion, which is fairly centralized, which we probably should not test. Simply like you shouldn't talk about religion at dinner, you shouldn't test it to see whether it should be decentralized or not. But there are other things. I believe that we are at a point in the maturity of the blockchain protocol where we can start to test something big. Instead of worrying of all the imitations of the first experiment around what is currency, we can create the next 0 to 1 invention by testing something big. Now, what do you think I will want to test? Human rights. I believe we have an opportunity in front of us to test to see whether we can create completely new human rights in a decentralized way. The 30 that are there were fantastic at the time when they were created. It took about 2,500 years to ratify them. They were made in 1948. They're very basic. You have the right to rest. You have the right to protest. You have the right to not be tortured. Well, those problems are over. Well, mostly. But we have other problems in the world. What if we wanted to create the 31st human right? How would we go about it? Some simple mathematics suggest that the first 30, because it took 2,500 years to make them, take about 100 years each to make. We're probably looking at 2118 to make a new human right. Well, let's test it. Human rights usually solve some big humanitarian issue. We just don't arrive at them. It's usually some injustice that is being done that creates the need for a right. A lot of times these injustices are unforeseen byproducts of massive inventions that were created. They're unforeseen byproducts of massive inventions that were created. For example, we didn't know that women couldn't vote until we invented governments. Prior to that, no one asked. So these big inventions usually have negative byproducts, and that gives rise to human rights. One of the negative byproducts of the last 20 years, which consists of the invention of mobile phones, the maturity of the internet, and all of the social networking and rich media that we see, is we've created something that we never imagined would happen. We created a human data marketplace. Our data, your data coming off of your body, is being used in a marketplace. Microsoft bought LinkedIn, and they paid an average of $260 per user for that data. None of that money made it back to the actual users of LinkedIn. You know why? because you don't own your data as property. We don't. There are tons of laws around data privacy, but there's nothing that says my data is property. A good medical record, by a good medical record, I mean someone who's interesting, maybe because they're sick, could sell for $400 to $500 American dollars multiple times a year to multiple buyers. And not a dollar of that goes back to the human being. Our driver records are being sold, on average, about $24 a pop in the United States of America. Sold by the government, by the way. All of your speeding tickets and traffic lights, none of that comes back to us because it's not our property. If you're a doctor, there's a $2 billion industry selling your behaviors and what you prescribe and when you open and what insurance you take. None of that goes back to the doctor. We are sitting in a massive digital humanitarian crisis. Our data is being sold in secondary and tertiary markets to the tune of $200 billion a year, and not a cent comes back to us. But we have human rights.